This brave U.S. Army soldier crashes deep inside enemy territory during a battle. The enemies capture him and torture him in brutal and different ways. The story begins during the time when the U.S. military was at war with several Vietnamese forces. The conflict had grown so intense that people began to fear it might spark another world war. Everyone was terrified, hiding inside their homes, while the skies above were filled with military aircraft attacking each other relentlessly. The situation had become critical. America had a massive army, powerful enough to destroy Vietnam in one strike, yet even they weren't sure who was truly at fault or why this war had even begun. A special unit of soldiers was prepared to attack a section of Vietnam, and among them was a man named Dengler, a skilled pilot who loved flying military planes. Following his commander's instructions, he flew toward the target area and began his assault after receiving the signal, firing missiles and bullets continuously. The region was surrounded by dense forest, making it difficult for Dengler to see his targets clearly. Hidden among the trees, enemy soldiers suddenly opened fire on his plane. Despite trying to evade them, his aircraft took heavy damage and crashed in the dangerous jungle below. Somehow, Dengler survived the crash, but he immediately realized he was deep in enemy territory, where being spotted could mean instant death. So, he fled into the forest, trying to hide. Unfortunately, local Vietnamese soldiers had already seen him and were moving in fast with guns drawn. Dengler, using his survival training, tried to camouflage himself with leaves and remained still until a rescue team could arrive. His plan worked for a while. No one could see him, even as enemy soldiers searched nearby. He knew that if they found him, the torture would be far worse than death itself. To stay safe from insects and exposure, he wrapped himself in a plastic sheet and remained motionless for hours. Just when it seemed hopeless, he heard the distant roar of a helicopter above. It was a U.S. rescue team. Dengler quickly tried to crawl out and signal them, but by the time he reached an open spot, the helicopter had already flown away. No matter how much he shouted, they couldn't hear him. Frustrated and exhausted, Dengler refused to give up, determined to survive no matter what awaited him next. He quickly traveled toward the higher, rocky regions, trying to see which direction the U.S. military rescue team had gone. It was clear that Dengler was now trapped there. He also realized that the rescue team probably wasn't coming back. Thirst was consuming him, so he left the area and reached a nearby lake. He drank the water desperately, but suddenly he heard voices, the voices of Vietnamese soldiers who had spotted him. They rushed toward him and took him into custody. Dengler couldn't resist, knowing even a small mistake could cost him his life. The Vietnamese soldiers tied his hands and began leading him away. This area once belonged to a local tribe that these soldiers used to protect. All of them were against the war between the U.S. military and Vietnam. None of the villagers or soldiers wanted conflict, but for some reason, the U.S. forces were pushing the war forward. For now, Dengler had become a prisoner, brought to the tribe in a brutal manner as if he had committed a serious crime. It was clear he would be punished severely, and this was only the beginning. He would face several levels of torment, and no one knew if he could endure it till the end. The soldiers tied him to the ground inside the village. Dengler tried to explain that he hadn't come to fight, that he was only passing through by plane, but the Vietnamese soldiers didn't understand English, and Dengler couldn't speak Vietnamese. With no way to communicate, they decided to take him to an officer who knew English. Soon, Dengler stood before that officer, and they began to talk. The officer questioned him about his origin and the mission the U.S. military had sent him on. At first, Dengler tried to trick him by saying he wasn't from the U.S., that he was from another country, working for money. But as the officer pressed for the truth, Dengler couldn't lie anymore. He admitted that he was part of the U.S. military, had lived in America his whole life, and had always dreamed of flying planes. Becoming a pilot was his childhood dream, and when it didn't happen the easy way, he joined the Air Force. He thought flying military planes would fulfill his dream, never realizing he'd one day be trapped deep in enemy territory. The officer then handed him a document to sign, which stated that the U.S. military was entirely at fault for the conflict and wanted Vietnamese soldiers to fight each other. Signing it would mean publicly humiliating the U.S. military, so Dengler refused outright. The officer and the Vietnamese soldiers became furious, so they dragged Dengler back to the tribe and began to torture him at different levels. First they tied his leg to a buffalo with a rope, and the buffalo dragged him through the village while the soldiers and townspeople mocked him and threw dirt on him. Dengler suffered greatly, but that was only the beginning. After parading him around, they plunged him into water and repeatedly forced his face under so he couldn't breathe. This went on for a long time. After inflicting so much pain, they transferred him to a place where many others were held captive. When Dengler woke, he discovered several U.S. soldiers were among the prisoners, two of them named Jean and Ben. They told him they had been held here for more than a year and every escape attempt had failed. Dangler couldn't stay, he had to get out and live. Jean warned him the rainforest itself would kill any escapee. Without water you wouldn't survive long, and if you made it past that, wild animals and venomous snakes would. Dangler grew more worried. That night the soldiers came and bound all their hands and feet so no one would attempt to run. Dangler begged his companions for a tool to loosen the restraints. At dawn he found a sharp nail and kept it. When night fell and the guards left after binding them, he used the nail to free everyone. Dangler was skilled at this, he'd done work like it before and was used to opening many locks manually. He could see US military pilots passing overhead, but they were too high to notice them. The plan was simple, they had to trick the Vietnamese soldiers and escape. Jean, Ben, and the other criminals held their agreed to help. They decided to strike when the guards went to eat, because the soldiers would leave their weapons aside. If the prisoners could grab those weapons quickly, they could capture the guards and signal any passing planes for rescue. Everyone agreed and began to execute the plan, observing which soldier held which position. One day, while they were marking the soldiers' exact positions with small stones and sticks, a soldier came in and pointed his gun at them, but Dangler calmly showed him it was just a game they were playing for entertainment. The soldier believed him and left to return to his duty. At night, Dangler slipped away, removed the bamboo barrier, and proved they could escape that way. He had memorized the entire route and told his companions they would break out that night. They had to, resources were running out, even the soldiers were short on food, so what could they feed the prisoners? Dangler and the others were reduced to eating insects. One day the soldiers gathered in the kitchen and began arguing about supplies. Dangler's group listened closely. Luckily one man in Dangler's team understood Vietnamese and, overhearing their discussion, learned that the soldiers blamed the US attacks for ruined crops and had decided to kill all the criminals, planning to take them into the forest, shoot them, and claim they tried to escape. That made it urgent to leave immediately. They waited for the moment when the guards went to eat. Dangler split his team into two groups, Dangler and Jean in one, the others attacking from the other side with weapons. They removed the bamboo screen, grabbed hidden guns, and prepared to strike. But Jean's condition was worse than before and Ben's group did not return, leaving poor Dangler alone. He opened fire on the nearby soldiers, some were killed and others fled. A local village man who had secretly fed them in the past was spared. Dangler gathered whatever supplies remained, even trying to take soldiers' boots since traveling barefoot through the forest would be deadly. After collecting gear, Dangler and Jean headed into the forest. If the soldiers returned they would kill them without hesitation. Their dangerous journey into the dense jungle, full of deadly animals, had begun. Dangler and Ben reached a cave with some weapons and were stunned to find their second team already there. In fact, the four members Dangler had counted on for the plan had deserted and taken the gathered supplies for themselves, which infuriated Dangler because their lives had been put at risk. They had only thought of themselves and put everyone else in danger. Dangler also noticed that Jean still had plenty of resources. The men had even taken his supplies, from shoes to several guns. Jean told him one of the missing members had taken Dangler's shoes and tried to escape alone, thinking he could make it out. Dangler was furious but kept calm, asking Jean for a knife in exchange for some bullets. They struck a deal, and Dangler still invited them to come along. However, the two men with Jean decided to take a different route through the forest, so with no other choice, Dangler set out with Ben into the deep jungle. Neither of them knew which path was right, but they had to keep moving because soldiers could arrive at any moment. Dangler knew this direction was their best chance, it led toward Thailand. As a soldier, he had a good sense of geography. As they pushed forward, the rain began pouring heavily. It was a blessing at first since it gave them drinking water, and they still had a few scraps of food left. Dangler and Ben supported each other like brothers, trying to stay nourished and strong. But soon the downpour caused mud and rocks to slide from above, triggering a dangerous landslide. The force of the water sent them tumbling downhill, injuring them badly, but they kept going. Ben, however, had grown extremely weak from illness and exhaustion. Dangler cared for him as best he could, and together they made a plan to reach a nearby river, build a raft, and follow the current toward Thailand, where they'd finally be safe. They continued walking in the direction Dangler remembered until they found the river. Gathering nearby wood, they built a rough raft and set off downstream. But the current grew stronger, slamming them into rocks and tearing the raft apart. Both were thrown into the water and injured even more, finally dragging themselves to the shore. Their resources were nearly gone, and walking barefoot through the jungle was dangerous beyond words. Their feet were shredded by sharp stones. While searching the area, Dangler found a torn shoe and gave it to Ben to wear on his most injured foot, though both their feet were bleeding. Nature, it seemed, was mercilessly testing their will to survive. Several leeches had latched onto their bodies, sucking their blood. Despite that, they had to keep moving toward their destination. At one point, Bun's strength completely gave out, and he told Degler he couldn't go any farther. He even told him to continue alone. But Degler refused to leave him behind. As they traveled on, they came across what once used to be a village, but now all the houses were covered in thick vegetation. The two of them sat down in that overgrown area to rest. Suddenly, Degler heard the sound of a helicopter in the sky. It was from the US military. He immediately started shouting and waving, hoping they'd spot him and rescue them. Unfortunately, the helicopters flew past without noticing. Degler's voice was too faint, and in such a dense forest, it was impossible to attract attention without a proper signal. Frustrated and heartbroken, Degler went back to Bun, whose condition had worsened. As they sat together, Bun suddenly told Degler to stop yelling so loudly or the soldiers would find them and capture them brutally, but in reality, Degler hadn't said a word. Bun was hallucinating due to his illness, hearing voices that weren't there. Degler carefully laid him down to rest and went to start a fire. He rubbed pieces of wood together until sparks appeared and flames began to rise. His plan was to use the fire both for warmth and as a signal. He set dry leaves and abandoned huts ablaze, hoping the smoke would be visible from the air. Soon, when US military helicopters flew overhead again, they spotted the rising flames. Degler waved frantically below, signaling for help, but instead, the helicopters began firing at him. The soldiers thought they were Vietnamese enemies setting a trap. Degler narrowly escaped the gunfire, shouting that he was one of them, but his weak voice couldn't reach the pilots. The helicopters eventually flew off, leaving Degler and Bun alone once more. Despite all their desperate efforts, no one came to help. The fact that his own people had unknowingly tried to kill him broke Degler's spirit. Both men were now extremely weak and frail from hunger and exhaustion. As they continued through the forest, they finally reached the other side, where they discovered a few villagers living nearby. The Vietnamese villagers deeply hated the US military, and they didn't like American citizens either. The moment they saw Degler and Bun, they rushed forward with sharp tools and tried to attack them. Degler and Bun sat down peacefully, begging for forgiveness and pleading for mercy, but the villagers were furious. Without hesitation, they struck Bun with their weapons, killing him instantly. Shocked and heartbroken, Degler pulled out his knife and tried to scare them off. Startled, the villagers panicked and scattered in different directions. Degler ran for his life and hid in the thick bushes while the villagers searched everywhere for him. Sitting quietly in the dark, Degler's mind was filled with countless thoughts. He had witnessed horrific things, and now his only companion was dead. His mental state began to collapse. He started hearing voices, convinced that Bun was still alive and talking to him. His mind couldn't tell the difference between reality and illusion anymore. All he knew was that he had to protect himself and kill anyone who threatened him, because everyone around was selfish and only cared for their own survival. Still hiding in the jungle, Degler stumbled upon a group of Vietnamese soldiers eating nearby. He waited patiently until the area cleared, then sneaked in to eat the leftovers they had left behind. His body desperately needed the nourishment. That night, as he sat alone, he imagined Bun sitting beside him again, complaining about the pain in his leg. Degler even took off his shoes and offered them to him, but in reality, Bun wasn't there at all. It was just another hallucination. Degler had now fully turned into a tribal survivor, living off nature's resources and avoiding both villagers and soldiers to stay alive. One morning, while traveling, he reached a swampy area and spotted a snake. Without hesitation, he killed it and started eating it raw. It showed how desperate his condition had become. Most water snakes aren't venomous, and even if they bite, there's usually nothing to worry about. They're actually one of the safest food sources, packed with protein. Degler ate what he could, but soon after, he heard the familiar sound of a helicopter above. It was a US military aircraft approaching his location. Wasting no time, Degler began shouting at the top of his lungs and waving large leaves to signal his position. Fortunately, this time, the US soldiers finally spotted him. The US helicopter quickly descended through the thick jungle air, hovering directly above Degler's position. A rope ladder was dropped down toward him, swaying wildly in the downdraft of the spinning blades. The moment he saw it, Degler's eyes filled with relief and disbelief. After so many days of pain, hunger, and hopelessness, rescue had finally come. He took a moment to steady his breathing, his heart pounding in his chest, before gripping the rope with trembling hands. Every muscle in his exhausted body screamed as he began climbing upward, inch by inch, toward salvation. But just as he was halfway up, shouts erupted from below. A group of Vietnamese soldiers and angry villagers had spotted him. They raised their rifles and opened fire, bullets tearing through the trees. Instantly, the US soldiers aboard the helicopter responded with machine gun bursts, the deafening sound echoing through the valley. The air was filled with chaos, dust, smoke, and the violent clash of gunfire. For a few terrifying seconds, it seemed like Degler might be hit, but the American gunners provided enough cover fire to drive the enemy back into the jungle. Finally, bleeding and breathless, Degler was pulled into the helicopter. As soon as he collapsed inside, one of the medics checked his pulse while the pilots veered away from the combat zone. The roar of the rotors grew softer as they left the danger behind. Degler closed his eyes, feeling the first sense of safety he'd had in weeks. Within hours, they reached a military hospital where doctors rushed him into emergency care. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in injuries, but he was alive, a miracle survivor of a nightmare no one else had escaped. For several long hours, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Degler's condition. His body was weak and battered, but the medical team provided him with fluids, nutrients, and the care he desperately needed. Gradually, color returned to his face, and his breathing steadied. When word reached his battalion that Degler had survived, everyone was stunned. No one who had ever entered that part of the jungle had come back alive, until now. Degler had done the impossible. He had endured unimaginable pain, hunger, and fear, yet somehow found the strength to make it home. His fellow soldiers rushed to the hospital to see him, many unable to hold back tears as they congratulated him for his bravery and resilience. Once Degler recovered, the story of his miraculous survival spread like wildfire across the entire country. Newspapers, radio stations, and television networks all carried the same headline: U.S. soldier returns alive from the deadliest zone. People were in awe of the man who had escaped an area where American captives were never spared. Civilians and military officers alike celebrated him, thanking him for his courage and cheering his name wherever he went. His determination had turned him from an unknown soldier into a national hero. Degler became a symbol of hope, resilience, and patriotism, someone who had looked death in the eyes and returned stronger than ever. The recognition he received was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Once a man struggling to survive in the depths of the jungle, he was now a national figure admired by millions. And that's where our story comes to an end.